So welcome everybody to workshop number 4. It was kind of a good month for people to register because in most months we only have 4 Tuesdays, so we only have 4 presenters. September 2020, we ended up with 5 Tuesdays. So we're on our 4th session now, and we have one more next week. I'm really excited to introduce Verna St. Denis. As I mentioned last week with Curtis Acosta, the first 2 guests that we had are people who I've known for a long time. The second 2 guests, Dr. Acosta and Dr. St. Denis, are people whose work I've known for a long time. And I think the first thing I can remember reading that you wrote was, I think, a book chapter from like 2007 or 2008 about culture theory and Aboriginal education.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say probably the 2 people that I cite most often in my work are tonight's guest, Dr. Verna St. Denis and Gloria Latson-Billings are probably the 2 people that these days I'm citing more than anyone else. That's pretty good.
Pretty good.
Pretty good couple of scholars and folks there. So before I do a full introduction and read the bio here, just a quick couple announcements. Feel free to use the chat box to chat and whatever you want to do. If you have a question, remember to post it in the Q&A, so that I'll know that those are where the questions are going to be. So I am going to introduce Dr. Verna St. Denis, and then I am going to turn off my video and my audio, and she will do a presentation, and then I will come back and ask a couple questions and then pose some questions to you all. But I'm super excited tonight because I've been wanting to talk to you for such a long time. I've just kind of admired your work, and as we were mentioning earlier, there's a little bit of overlap in some of the issues that we talk about in our work. So I'm just so excited. So I'm going to put on the glasses so I can read the bio here. Dr. Verna St. Denis is a professor of education at the University of Saskatchewan in the Department of Educational Foundations, where she has taught undergraduate and graduate courses in critical anti-racist education since 1992. She identifies as both Cree and Métis and is a member of the Beardies and Okemasis First Nation. Am I getting that pronunciation right? I should have asked you about that before I started introducing you. Her doctoral research explored the impact of functional anthropology and cultural theory on problematizing the educational policy and practice in Indigenous education. If you all haven't read any of her work, that's such a good description of so much of your scholarship, and it's so powerful that educational policy and practice in Indigenous education. I really encourage you all to read it, and maybe I'll send folks a couple of your links to some of your articles. So basically explain how colonialism used cultural theory to depoliticize the education of Indigenous students and to further pathologize Indigenous people. Her research has also involved exploring the knowledge and experience of Indigenous teachers, particularly in public schools. And a third area of scholarship and teaching is in promoting the necessity of anti-racist education and how we offer the education to white identified teacher education students and as in service to teachers and administrators. So basically seeking to understand the emotional and political investments white settler subjects have in rejecting an anti-colonial and anti-racist.
Did I write that?
What's that?
I said, did I write that? Oh my God.
I'm loving this. This is actually a really good description of your
I, I,
scholarship.
I probably don't send that biography out very often,
Oh,
but I'd send it to you.
it's really great. Uh, this research and scholarship has been mobilized through a 2010 study commissioned by the Canadian Teachers Federation on the professional knowledge and experience of Aboriginal teachers in Canadian public schools. She has been bestowed with many awards, including the Arbus Award of the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation for Distinguished Service to Education in the Teaching Profession, the 2008 R.W.B. Jackson Award for Outstanding English Language Article by the Canadian Educational Research Association for her paper entitled Aboriginal Education and Anti-Racist Education, Building Alliance Across Cultural and Racial Identity, which is an amazing piece. Other journal publications such as What Makes Anti-Racist Pedagogy Difficult, Troubling National Discourse in Anti-Racist Curricular Planning, Rethinking Cultural Theory in Aboriginal Education, and Silencing Aboriginal Curricular Content and Perspectives. There are other children here. Okay, woo, you have been busy
Yeah,
with all
yeah.
of this. So,
Thank you.
so I'm really excited to get your presentation and to talk with you. And I am going to turn it over to you. And we'll make sure you
Okay.
got your screen share working, and
Okay.
then I will.
All right. Thank you, Paul. And so I'm being heard. I don't have to yell. This is good.
Yes, the audio is coming through great.
And there we go. So you just see the PowerPoint. You don't see, like for me, I can see where the slides are coming on next.
Yes. So if you just, I think if you
I
click on,
should go from play from the start.
yes, I think.
Like
yeah.
that?
Yeah, there you go.
Is that better? Okay. Yeah, so thank you, Paul, for this invitation, because it actually provides me with another opportunity to think about what it is I know and what I believe about teaching on race inequality. And yes, as Paul mentioned, we've never met, but I have assigned Paul's work, publications in my undergraduate and graduate teaching, particularly his critique of Ruby Payne's take on poverty, education, and this idea about understanding cultures of poverty, so to speak. And part of it is because a few years ago I learned that many school divisions in the province of Saskatchewan bought copies of her book for distribution among school teachers, presumably as a way for them to understand how to work with low income and primarily Indigenous families and students attending public schools. And so that's kind of how I was looking for, a critique, and came upon Paul's work. So my presentation today is Critical Autobiography as Anti-Racist Pedagogy. And it's something that I've done at the undergraduate level for some years, and then stopped doing it, and then revive it in a pedagogy of anti-racism. But also, in terms of my own autobiography, I was really inspired by my grad students who urged me to, because in my own teaching, I would always share life experiences as examples of the theory that we were discussing, the anti-colonial, anti-racist theory. And so over the last couple of years, I've started to develop both, and actually, it is true that today provided an opportunity to bring together some of the theory and thinking around the necessity of critical autobiography. And my fellow colleague, Dr. Carol Schick, and I actually have a short chapter published in a gender studies book that looks at the importance and the value of critical autobiography for white identified students. So it is true that I've taught and worked in teacher education since the mid 80s. I am the product of Indigenous organizations and Indigenous institutions that saw a growth and development starting in the 70s and the 80s. And so I was mentored by Indigenous people who had been involved in politics and education for already seasoned people. So initially in my teaching career, the first 10 years were primarily working in Indigenous and Métis teacher education programs. And then, of course, since '92 in white teacher education program. So a few years back, I took to reading memoirs of social activists. Many of us do. And the one that I read was one of the ones I read was by Howard Zinn. Talking to primarily an American audience, so you'd all know who Howard Zinn is. But I really took to heart his statement of when he became a teacher, he could not possibly keep out of the classroom his own experiences. He says, I often wondered how many teachers manage to spend a year with a group of students and never reveal who they are, what kind of lives they live, where their ideas come from, and what they believe, and what they want for themselves, for their students, and for the world. And so I took that as support and acknowledgement and validation of the kind of teaching that I'd already been doing. And certainly it kind of challenges this idea that I felt like that it challenges this idea that teachers are neutral, objective vessels of neutral, objective knowledge, and encourages us to know who we are. And I think that this idea of knowing who we are is a principle of Indigenous education and Indigenous philosophy and worldview. And so my story and my life is shaped by the practice of settler colonialism, as described by settler colonialism in Canada, as described and theorized by Patrick Wolf, who argues that settler cultures have developed complex, and he's writing out of Australia, that they develop complex narratives that erase Indigenous people's humanity. And that is partly accomplished by perpetuating the belief in this notion of empty lands, or terra nullius, which we know is quite contrary, and which we as Indigenous people still resist that kind of narrative and national story that's told not only in Australia, but Canada and the US. And we resist that, and an example of that resistance is evident in the explosion here in Canada of First Nations engaging with land-based pedagogy and acknowledging and respecting that the land is our teacher. And so my traditional territories on and in the area that is now called Saskatchewan. And so that's just a downloadable map of Saskatchewan. And I grew up, so here's more or less the continent of North America. And then I grew up right on the edge of the national park. So this area right where I'm moving my cursor. And I'm now living and working here in Saskatoon. And down here, of course, we border on North Dakota, maybe a little bit of Montana. And yeah, and so the pink area, so this is another map of Saskatchewan. So I'm Treaty 6. My treaty goes almost right across the province of Saskatchewan and into Alberta. And so this is just a close-up of the Prince Albert National Park. So that the establishment of that national park occurred in 1927. And I was born in this Rhode Island community of Park Valley, right in here. And I think I was the first, let's see, I'm sixth born. Yeah, I guess I was the second child of my mother and father to be born in a hospital. So I was born right in this community up here. But that national park, basically what it did, it contributed to the criminalization of people like my father, who was a hunter and a trapper. And so it established this boundary here that said that that we could not, hunt moose or trap beyond that boundary. And so, of course, that has shaped a lot of impacted a lot of our experiences in our lives. And then I went to elementary school in towns across this area. And then my mother is from First Nations, just a little bit further south of there. So I started teacher education in 1978, and it was the first time that I was in a learning environment with all Indigenous people, and it was such a profound experience for me, because I'd gone to small rural Saskatchewan schools where pretty much by third grade, many Indigenous students that were in the class or in the school had vanished or like disappeared, were no longer attending. And so when I started in the Indian teacher education program, so here in Canada, Indian teacher education programs were established as a way to fulfill the policy of Indian control of Indian education. And so, and that policy also informs the importance of autobiography and knowing who you are. So in 1992, the Indian control of Indian education declared that unless a child learns about the forces which shape him, the history of his people, their values and customs, their language, he will never really know himself or his potential as a human being. And so that statement also has guided the kinds of interventions that we do in education, both in the K-12 system as well as at post-secondary. Because I guess when those discussions were happening in the late 60s, our leaders were challenging the practice that had been up till then, that in schools we were taught to be ashamed of our families, our way of life. And as Patrick Wolf has argued in the Australian context, also our Indigenous networks of kinship and community belonging were denigrated as a practice of settler colonialism. And so it's important for me as an Indigenous teacher to work with the Indigenous students that I do to begin to develop that and reaffirm that idea of who they are. But I'm going to also talk about non-Indigenous white identified students as well, and the importance of doing critical autobiography. So in terms of my own history, I just want to, so this is a picture of my mother, and she's visiting a relative in the city. That would have been her firstborn child. And she was someone who navigated the colonial institutions and struggled and did speak back to the constant surveillance that we often experienced as children, for whom social services organizations were, at that time in the 50s and the 60s, Indigenous families were regarded as incapable of caring for their own children, and my mom fought against that, and then my dad, my mom went to residential school, so she learned how to read and she learned how to write. She was only in residential school for 2.5 years. And there's a story about how her mother rescued her from her and her siblings, her 3 other siblings, from residential school. My dad, whereas my dad is Métis, or regarded as Métis community, he spoke French, he spoke Michif, and he spoke Cree. He was most fluent in those languages. Métis people until the 50s didn't have access to public education. They were denied because they were regarded as landless, no landowning, and so didn't pay taxes, and therefore didn't have access to public schools. And this picture is the only one that I have of my dad. He was probably, I don't know, in his early 20s. Spent some years in the sanatorium for tuberculosis, and so he also, as I mentioned earlier, was a hunter and trapper. That was his way of making a living. Although he joined the labor, working unskilled labor as the years went by. And again, but between the two of them, they had to work together to make sure that we weren't stolen by the forces around us. I mean, the government. And so, in Saskatchewan today, there's me. That's me living in that Rhode Island community. And again, this is one of the few pictures I have of myself. So as a child, so that's me around my 2nd birthday, standing outside our home with my eldest sister. And we lived there till we moved to town. In Saskatchewan today, Indigenous people constitute the largest racialized other. And in the last, so Treaty 6, I'll tell a story in a bit about that picture. But in Saskatchewan today, Indigenous people constitute the largest racialized other, and in the last 10 years or more, we have the increasing presence of racialized immigrant and refugee families arriving from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, and over the decades, increasingly large Filipino community. Other than that, it's been largely homogeneous white settler population, and Indigenous people have been marginalized to reservations until the 60s. And so consequently, the racial identity of most teachers in Saskatchewan and across the country are white identified. And most of our teacher candidates and teachers in schools are predominantly white identified, mostly lower middle class Canadian citizens, many third and fourth generation non-Anglo Saxon immigrant families. And so I just want to share this story about just, I guess, early August. My surviving siblings and I decided that we were going to go visit Fort Pitt. And Fort Pitt is the signing of Treaty 6, which is our treaty. And so we embarked on that trip. And I think later on I share some slides about that. But I guess in recent decades, that's what we've been committed to, is like claiming our land and claiming our territory. And certainly going out to Treaty 6 and Fort Pitt was, that's what it felt like, that we were reminding ourselves, but also settler communities that now occupy that area, that we're still here. And these are not lessons that we learned in school. This is a picture of my first grade classroom, and you may recognize in some Indigenous people, this was the beginning of integrated schooling in Canada, and I guess it follows much like Brown versus the board in the U.S. with the then open the desegregation. Actually, when we study the way in which Indigenous people have been treated in this province and in this country, there's some overlap in terms of like the policies and the procedures that happen in the U.S. then take place over here in Canada about 10 years later. So this is me here in grade 1, and various Indigenous relatives in the back here that eventually are not going to be there by grade 3. And I just recall showing this photograph to a relative, I guess a relative from my mom's First Nations, and she commented on my footwear. And the thing that she said to me, which was a surprise, was, "Oh, your parents must have been trappers." And I said, "How do you know that?" And she said, "Well, because what you're wearing on your feet." So that was a lesson, of that can be taught through our school pictures, in terms of, I'd never seen that, but it was terrifying being in a classroom like this, and watching how, like, this person here did not speak very good English, and just the terror that was struck in all of us by the kind of messages that we were receiving, or the resentment, as my colleague Carol Schick writes about, settler resentment for being in that space, sharing that space of learning. And clearly at this time, there was this idea of Canada being a white nation was deeply embedded. And, Canada inherited from the British a virulent sense of racial superiority, which placed beyond the pale anyone who was not English-speaking, fair-skinned, or devoutly Christian. And so what I'm doing here is I'm sharing with you some of the materials that I assign in my undergraduate class and graduate class sometimes, but that challenges and disrupts this idea that Canada is a multicultural, tolerant society, and look at the history of white supremacy in this country. and how it was normalized through school curriculum. And so, part of what we do is then I'm teaching primarily white identified teacher education students. And one of the additional comments that the Indian Control of Indian Education made is that that we should, in our educational initiatives, not only be addressing the needs of Indigenous students, but also the Committee of Indigenous Men and Women who crafted that policy also believed that it was essential that Canadian children of every racial origin have the opportunity during their school days to, and this is a quote, to learn about the history, customs, and culture of their country's original inhabitants and first citizens. And then I've also extended that to say, well, our white settler colleagues also need to understand the forces that shape them. And so, you know, when I was preparing this, I was reminded of a short chapter that I've used from time to time by Kathleen Cushman, who explores and advocates that we must help students to research their communities, as she believes students want to know, where do I come from and where am I going? And so, so for white identified students, we need to then question, like, what are the national myths that informed your settler family identity? And here then I would refer you to a short little article that's open access on the internet by a former grad student of mine, Sheila McLean. And she published a little article, 2-page actually, titled, We Built a Life from Nothing. And so in that, she challenges this idea of meritocracy and individualism that is so embedded in all school narratives and histories that we tell. In Canada, there are many are deeply invested in national mythologies that Canada is a land of limitless opportunity in which all who work hard will make it. So this belief in meritocracy is embedded in national narratives of the colonial settlement of this land, and that belief has such profound influence in how teaching occurs. These national narratives have served to minimize conflict over land and resources. For example, the Canadian national identity is constructed as peacekeeping, tolerant, multicultural, just as American national identity has been constructed as promoting freedom, liberty, and democracy, of course, which is all questionable historically and now and in the past. Nonetheless, these national myths and narratives influence what gets taught in public schools. And I think so, for this reason, engaging students in developing their own critical autobiography is necessary. And although I've taught many white identified teacher education students, I also make this assignment for Indigenous and racialized teacher education students. And so the next slide is actually from my colleague and former student, Sheila McLean. And this is part of what we read in our program, but also what I encourage to look at, like, what is the difference between the rights and benefits and privileges of white settlers as opposed to Indigenous people. And so, for example, in terms of voting rights, I mean, voting rights is still an issue, of course, down in the US. But for Indigenous people, we were not a part of the political system until the early 60s. And then, of course, many people have remained suspicious. Public education, because taxpayers pay for public education, whereas Indigenous people, students and kids and many generations of families removed to residential schools. And, this is Sheila going through her own family, because I've had her as a student, asked her to do her family history. Her family gained title to land, whereas Indigenous people were robbed of their land. White settlers had mobility rights. If they failed at farming, they could pick up being grain elevator operator or whatever. Whereas Indigenous people were subject to a pass and permit system that operated actually even into the 50s and 60s, where our movement was restricted. White settlers could run for public office, whereas Indigenous people had no representation. White settlers could sell the products of their work freely, whereas Indigenous people had severe limits placed on us. Support, and Sheila often talks about support for famine, how families, particularly in the 30s, were supported, low-cost loans, whereas Indigenous people were subject to mass starvation and not accessing personal loans at all. It was always, if you borrowed, you always had to pay a lot more back. And so I ask students to engage in that kind of critical examination of the advantages and the ways in which our government and institutions supported their success as a way to challenge that idea of meritocracy, because it's so often used against our people. So this here is a picture of my mother's maternal grandparents, Peter and Ida Pikakut, and that's my mom's mother. She's photobombing, I guess, in the picture there in the back. That's my mom, who I never met. She passed away before, and these folks did as well. But they were hunting and gathering people, and Edna back here, her husband, Edward, they hunted and trapped together. And so, for example, in terms of pass and permit system, this here is a permit that's giving my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, permission to go hunting in open season, and hunting for food. So that kind of restriction, on Indigenous people, and then that was also the way of like criminalizing. So if you're found off the reserve without a permit, then that can subject you to imprisonment. And this here is the script of my father's father, which is the way in which the Canadian government was extinguishing Indigenous rights, Métis rights to land, was by buying, like, basically, many could not read or write. So I'm just trying to look at, I think he signed his name by X and gave up title to land in 1900. So I mentioned going to Fort Pitt, which is the site of Treaty 6 signing, and that's the bullet-pocked cairn that's there to acknowledge that area, and then a cairn in memory of Big Bear, who defended Indigenous people, large area of what is now Saskatchewan. And this is a picture of my eldest brother, and standing there, contemplating what happened at Fort Pitt. So basically what they've done here is to rebuild just the footprint of what was 150 years ago, the grounds of Fort Pitt. And we brought my grandson along on that trip. And here he's standing at the grave site of 8 Cree men who were hung for defending their land, defending their rights, defending their peoplehood. And children from the residential school were brought by the colonizers to watch them hang to death 8 Cree male family and community members, and to tell, basically, I thought, like, to tell our children who is boss. So there's my grandchild now, and I'm trying to explain to him, what happened here, and to instill in him a sense of resistance, and so I'm just going to conclude, and I realize I'm taking more time here, but basically, what I've learned also from other scholars who are looking at the importance of life histories are, we must ask ourselves, like, what are the values demonstrated in our life histories and our stories? And what are the relationships that are exhibited in the stories that we tell? And this is by Deanna Reeder. And basically, at the same time, Kumashiro also reminds us that autobiography is not just about telling one story, but to ask students to write in ways that trouble the familiar stories of the heroism, in my case, of the heroism of pioneers and settlers. And so, and that's basically what I try to do in my teaching. And yeah, so I'll leave it there.
All right. That was great. Thank you. Do you want to, let's see if I can do this.
Should I, what should I do? Should I close this?
Oh,
no, I can stop sharing?
Yeah, you could do that. You can stop sharing. I'm not sure how to tell you how to do that.
Oh, yeah. I forgot to share this.
Oh, shoot. Did you want to share one more
sharing? Time? Oh, yeah, I did. Oh, I wanted to share one. Oh, host disabled. Okay, that's all right.
You can still go in there if you want.
Okay.
You just have to re-share.
Yeah, so part of doing autobiography, I found this photograph, this amazing photograph of my chaplain, my mother's grandmother, my great grandmother, and I just look at her, and it just like inspires me to, and I just think, wow, you're just standing there looking probably into the eyes of some Indian agent who's taking that photograph. And then just lastly, at the Fort Pitt, Indigenous teachers, this Indigenous teacher in public school said, we're the experts, whether they like us or not, we're coming in, we're going to make ourselves known. We're not going anywhere. We are still here. In 500 years from now, we will still be here. So that's from the Canadian Teachers Federation. And I guess just the inspiration that when we look into our own communities, the inspiration that's there to resist and to keep going is just what I wanted to share. So thank you.
Okay, awesome. So I've been sort of looking at the questions here. Somebody's asking where they can find your articles, that they went to your university webpage but didn't see any link to there. Do they need to be on research databases to find that, or are there any?
Some of them, yeah, but I think if you go to Google Scholar, and some of them are provided open access, or even Google. It's kind of funny, but it's there.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And also, if there are any that you want me to share with folks, you can send me a PDF and I can send them out and make them available.
Okay, and also on Academic EDU, if people are part of Academic EDU.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, academic.edu, yeah, or academia.edu, isn't it?
Academia, something like that. But I think if well, of course, I'm connected to a university, so you do Google Scholar and then you get access right away.
Yeah. So,
but it could be that some people have posted it just open access.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really encourage you all to look up some of those, and I can send some titles as well when I email the link out to the recording.
Yeah.
The um, the I want to ask you a question about the sort of critical autobiography thing. Is that uh, is that something you think teachers could do with any age of student to at least some extent, or do you think there needs, or is there an age at which you think?
Well, I've interviewed in my research a lot of Indigenous teachers in public schools, and that is like a reoccurring practice that many of them engage in grade 3, grade 6, is to, who's my community? Who are my community? Where am I situated? Whose land am I on? Who was here before we came? How did your family get here? And how do your family introduce themselves? What's the history of your name? All of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I cited, so in this book here, I'll just hold this book, Mika. I went to school with her at Stanford.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. In that book is an article by Kathleen Cushman. So this is geared to K to 12, right? And she has a little article called Helping Students Research Their Communities. And that's school-based, like K to 12.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems like, some of those questions like, whose land am I on? And
Oh,
that,
yes.
those are really powerful questions for all students, and especially for, the white settlers and the children and grandchildren. And,
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Like
even if,
whose Indigenous land are we on? Like, just to start to disrupt this idea of empty lands and terra nullius, and who had to be removed, and that's from the East Coast in the U.S. all the way to the West,
yeah,
and the same in Canada. And right now, I mean, I know you probably don't have the news, Canadian news, but there's like major conflict going on right now on the East Coast in the Atlantic waters over rights to fish for lobster.
Hmm.
And whereas the Mi'kmaq people are in the Bay of Fundy, asserting their treaty rights and sovereign rights to fish for lobster. I mean, there's just like violence. Like settler fishermen are just using violence actually to intimidate and threaten Indigenous people. So it hasn't gone away.
Yeah. Yeah. Same issues happening today.
Mm-hmm.
One other thing that I kind of thinking about in terms of the preparation that teachers need in order to engage students in this kind of critical autobiography learning is, thinking about, for instance, what does it mean for student? What does it mean for uh, to ask children who maybe because of settler colonialism, because of history of racism and that sort of thing, can't track their families back. And in a way, for some people, especially white people, it's almost like there's a privilege involved with being able to do that.
Documented.
And then you have other people who were brought to this continent as enslaved Africans, or people who were cut off from their ancestry, whether they're indigenous or, and how do you sort of think through those sorts of things?
Well, like it can be your broader community, right? That like we all have some community. And so if it's not family direct, it's the community that you identify with. How did they come to be there? It's only recently that we have, say, racialized immigrant students in teacher education, ask them to do this assignment. And it's a struggle if they've come via like, um, you know, running from some violence in their country of origin, that they've left everything behind. And they have very little access. But nonetheless, a couple years ago, I had students from Syria, Pakistan, and just the power of even talking to their grandparents, if there's no written records. And more than once, I've had students, white and students of color and Indigenous students, be instructed with this assignment, then start talking to their ancestors, to their relatives in a way that they never have, and learning things about who they are or who their community is in such an empowering kind of way. Like a while back, I had a student who prided himself on knowing about Ukrainian history and what his grandfather lived through. Mm-hmm. And then he did the assignment and he was like, I just didn't know nothing.
Yeah.
And then a couple of years ago, I had an Indigenous student who had no idea that her grandmother went to residential school. We started looking in the archives. We used to have archives at Saskatchewan, and archivists used to be annoyed with me a little bit because I'd send all my students over there. And she found actual photographs. And she had no idea.
Wow.
That her grandmother went to residential school, because her grandmother had just tuned that out, never applied for reparations, and didn't want anything to do with it.
Huh.
And then I had a student from Pakistan who interviewed her father or her grandfather, and she was trying to explain to him why they were doing this assignment, and so she's explaining, and then she's trying to explain about Indigenous people to him, and then he says to her, oh, if they are not free, if Indigenous people are not free, then we are not free. Mm. And that's an inspiration for this young woman who will now spend the next 30 years being a teacher.
That's really powerful.
It's powerful.
Yeah. One way that some of our scholarship has interacted, I think, is that we're both a little suspicious of the disproportionate, of what I think we would both call a disproportionate role that kind of culture plays in anti-racism education. Mm-hmm. And you've written about it specifically around Aboriginal or Indigenous education, where the response isn't anti-racism, but the response is like cultural learning. That's what the response ends up being. In place of racial justice, we get some stereotyped cultural exploration kind of thing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, my mind goes in different directions, Like, first of all, we have a context of multiculturalism that it's so dominant. Like, that's the way we do it, dress, dance, and what's the other D? But really, like the kind of like the just the things that can be celebrated. But in terms of cultural theory, yes, well, the only way I can explain it is by sharing a story of my own experience of going to teacher education in an Indian teacher education program where who we are, our language, our history is valued. And I went home to my parents and I said, why didn't you teach me Cree? You both speak Cree. And they're like, oh, they were confused because the promise was that we would be accepted if we learned English only. But I was in that context where being Indigenous was was valued, and I didn't feel like I had the markers. So it took me a long time, a couple of decades, to figure out how is it that we as Indigenous people at one point had too much culture and that had to be beaten out of us. And then post Second World War, suddenly now we don't have enough and that we need to be restored. And we need to be restored. And so I was thinking, how is this culture, what is this culture that can be taken and, like, I guess an essentialist, static, classical, anthropological, let's go look at the natives and document them as they were, rather than seeing culture as ongoing, adapting and changing to current conditions. And so that's what I kind of always concerned about, is that we are always cultural beings, but the way in which we think about culture, it's sort of like this static thing that people in the past were cultural, but we aren't. So really much, and of course, then I went to Stanford, and my supervisor's Renato Rizaldo, who did a critique as an anthropologist of the discipline and the practice of anthropology. This is like 3-4 decades ago. So, so I guess my work has been about tracing the history of this kind of narrowing definition, essentialized definition of what culture is. Mm-hmm. And then I've been interested in, like, how did so with Franz Boas in the turn of the 19th century, challenging or promoting cultural relativism, and, quote, being an anti-racist at that era, saying like all cultures are equally valued. Then how did culture become deterministic, like innately deterministic?
Yeah.
And I studied that, and how, like, psychology and functional anthropology came together to basically freeze us in time. So I don't want to be, as an Indigenous person, frozen in time, as unadaptable.
Yeah. Well, that also, I think, connects to probably why we both had the same reaction to that Ruby Payne culture of poverty thing, which has some of those same attributes of let's go study the poor people kind of thing and make a list of their, which is mostly ends up being stereotypes. And then the way that can actually distract us from the actual anti-oppression justice work.
Yeah. The context in which we are trying to survive as a people gets erased through like cultural discourse, cultural focusing on culture without looking at history and politics, and economics.
That's such an important thing for teachers who are trying to teach racial justice to remember, because I think that's a thing that probably happens more, at least in the US, and the teaching about Indigenous people, whereas teaching about some other histories might be more about fights for liberation. And then Indigenous, it's like, here are 5 stereotypes, also erasing the huge amount of diversity.
Well, that's the other thing, yes.
That the word Indigenous holds, that's a huge,
Yeah. Like the ideas, they kind of like, for me, I remember, like, say 30 years ago, and I was trying to say, how do we address the diversity within Indigenous people, that we're not this, because scholarship coming out of the 40s and the 50s, even into the 60s, they used to have these typologies. White people are like this and Indians are like that. And I was like, Indians are cooperative and white people are competitive. Like, just, lots of those tables. And I as a young woman, I couldn't make sense. I just didn't make sense of the, like, I couldn't fit myself into what I was supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I saw the diversity around me of Indigenous people, from those who practice traditional ceremonial to fundamentalist Christians.
Yeah.
And it seemed that this concept of culture was creating problems.
Yeah.
In terms of understanding who we are. So I trying to banish that word.
You and I both. Yeah.
And talk about social and politics and economics and history and location.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a couple of people are asking about land acknowledgements, and one of the, I do a lot of work in Canada, especially around Toronto, and I find any educational event starts with a land acknowledgement, and I see it happening a little bit in the U.S., not to the same extent. I see it happening
That's a good
in
question.
Canada, and I'm just kind of curious about your take on that, and what is the difference between doing that in a way that seems that seems kind of like we're just kind of going through the motion of it versus a way that's actually meaningful.
Yeah, well, it has become very formulaic.
Yeah.
It's become very superficial. Like, I remember when I first heard, when one of the very first places that I heard the reclaiming of Indigenous space and land was out in British Columbia, because that's unceded territory. So in Canada, that's a site of lots of conflict. Um, and Indigenous people were reclaiming how they named their locations, and the name for, not Queen Charlotte Islands, but Hideaway. But I don't know, like, it seems like dominant institutions just have a way of, like, neutralizing these, what are potentially resistant strategies. And so yeah, we all do that here. It's become pretty commonplace, and I don't even know if anybody really thinks about it. And then the other thing is, sometimes you'll hear, like, non-Indigenous people say greetings in our languages.
Right.
And I don't know, okay, I'm just going to say this. It kind of annoys me, because I think if that's the gesture for reparation, then it's no different from multiculturalism then. Because our history is still not being taught. Who we are is still not being taught. We are still not invited or welcome in as employees, as teachers. Teachers have such a hard time teaching in public schools. So rather than making those little token gestures, let's actually hire our people.
Yeah.
That would be one thing. Hire them and then retain them and support them when they actually start teaching against the grain. That hasn't happened. And I was the external examiner for a PhD out of Australia, where it was about reconciliation. And she does an ethnography of 2 schools in which this land acknowledgement has become, like, just so kind of like, students don't even know why they're saying it.
Yeah.
So what does that actually mean when we do the acknowledgement? Then let's learn about that, what that actually means.
And of course, it would be more meaningful if there's actually something being done to change the material condition, to correct the actual injustice.
Well, you go downtown in Saskatoon, and we're just a population of 250,000 maybe. And then the visibility of, like, homelessness of Indigenous people is unethical. The lack of affordable housing, public housing, non-existent. the supports for mental health, non-existence. Like now people are wanting to talk about trauma. Do you all have that in the US as well? Like
Yeah,
trauma-informed teaching and trauma-informed
very popular.
practice?
Yeah,
Very popular. Well, I think we can do that as long as we understand like where that trauma came from, the colonial violence
yeah,
that's ongoing.
yeah,
And this is what I've talked about this. I still have to write about it because I am interested in where we're going with that kind of trauma discourse. Because as I said earlier, first of all, like how we as Indigenous people are constantly being reproduced as deficit, 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 deficit. And I worry that trauma informed without any political, economic analysis of what institutions have done reinforce that
yeah,
in a way that, you know, we had too much culture in the 60s after the Second World War because of the genocide. Now they had to restore us to our original state. And now in the 2000s, we're 21st century, we're talking about trauma. And what I'm seeing embedded, like it's embedded in policy, is now we're too damaged to learn. So it's just like deficit, deficit, deficit.
yeah. I'll have to send you an article I wrote for Ed Leadership about those problems. With I always say trauma-informed practices are completely hypocritical if they don't, one, first address the ways that we traumatize kids in the schools where we have trauma-informed practices, and two, if we're not attending to some of the most profound sources of not just trauma but intergenerational traumas such as colonialism, structural racism, sexism, all of those sorts of things. And it's like that stuff has been left out. So it's a very sort of privileged and potentially very deficit-oriented approach to trauma, which assumes that all of the traumas come from people's homes, not from the oppression that is bearing down on families and communities.
Yeah, like I was terrorized as a child by colonial institutions. And I would imagine, I mean, my parents never talked about it, but I'm pretty sure, like, you know, being under the threat of being removed as a child
Yeah.
because our parents were seen as inadequate.
Yeah, I mean, that's really proud. I mean, I challenge anyone who's doing trauma-informed stuff at your school. How are you accounting for that in your trauma-informed practices, right?
Yeah.
So we're out of time, but I just want to ask you one more question because I think it's a good question to end on. Somebody asked, what are your sources of hope that, you know, what keeps you involved in this work and like the sources of hope that things can get better?
Oh gosh. You know, I think working with inspiring and teaching Indigenous students, but also I think um, the the openness that many like white grad students I work with and the commitment that they develop to being anti-colonial, to being anti-racist, and you know, to risking exclusion among their peers to do this kind of work, but also just the increasing practice of Indigenous people as claiming our relationship to the land. I started out by talking about land-based pedagogy, and that is so powerful. Like I've worked with Indigenous teachers who are now practicing this in their First Nations communities, but also we see that happening in urban areas as well. And one of the most powerful experiences I had of that was the collaboration between archaeologists and Indigenous elders in the city of Toronto, reclaiming Toronto as Indigenous land. and working together to both verify the presence of Indigenous people there for hundreds of years, and then also the Indigenous stories that go along with that telling, that have been passed on through the generations and generations. It's like, wow, we are here and we're not going anywhere. Just like the teacher that I quoted at the end, like these Indigenous teachers in public schools, they're very adamant about what they're doing and the importance, their importance. And the other thing is, I think about my mother and the children that she bore, and the fact that most of her children were not born in hospitals. And when in the end, like, we have these ceremonies that about the umbilical cord and the placenta that tie us to the land forever and ever.
Mm.
You can't take it away.
Yeah.
We have a connection. And that so when I take my grandson out and teaching him and reminding him who we are, that's what we do.
Mm.
Yeah, and so I that's what gives me hope, and just seeing our people becoming more politically astute and engaged, and no longer like being silenced. The people are not silenced.
Well, thank you. What a powerful way to end. And I just had so much fun talking with you. It's very powerful. And, like I said, I've admired you for, seems like forever, basically, since I was reading your stuff at least 10, maybe 15 years ago. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for telling. I think it's so powerful when people are willing to tell some of their own story, and it's such great and powerful modeling for on all of us to dig into that for ourselves.
Yeah, that's what I had hoped, was to model. But also, I just want to say the last word to Paul, that I hadn't met you, but I liked your work. But also, I just now, meeting over the web, it's like, okay, he is who he writes.
Oh,
like that. Like, it makes it easier for me as a presenter that, oh, I think I could like you in real life. Like,
well, I hope we have an opportunity to meet in real life once the COVID's
yeah.
once all that mess is taken care of.